Hi everyone, and welcome to this episode of Keipert Labs. In today's video we're going to be discussing classification. So we're going to define what we mean by the term classification. We're going to look at a particular application of it to living things called taxonomy. We're going to introduce a system called the kingdom system, or the 5 kingdoms. We're going to then look at how we construct this system going from the level of kingdoms all the way down. We're going to learn a little mnemonic that's going to help you to be able to remember that system, and also go through some of the reasons of why we classify living things at all. So, classification. It's a complicated noun for a process that you've done all your life, or that's something that has allowed you to operate within daily life very successfully. It's essentially sorting things into groups based on similarities and differences. So 2 examples that you're very familiar with would be the supermarket and the library. The supermarket, things are classified into sections based on particular properties, so you know where to find things. Likewise, the library is classified with books on particular topics in particular areas. You have the Dewey Decimal System, for example, that helps you to be able to identify books on particular topics, and that it has an order and a pattern to it, so that no matter what library you go into anywhere in the world, that you can follow the same sort of system to find what you're after. Okay, and so it has meaning, it gives us structure and organisation to things that otherwise would be very messy and complicated. And so this also applies to living things. And the classification of living things we call taxonomy. So a scientist who helps to do this process is called a taxonomist. But the one thing to remember here is that taxonomy, this idea of sorting living things, is still essentially a man-made system. It is a way that we impose order and logic, or a system onto the world around us to help us to understand it better. Okay? It's not dictated by science, but by man instead. So that means that even though we're trying to identify and categorize every organism, that there is still debate between scientists and in the scientific community as to what's the best way, what's the most comprehensive or simplest system to be able to use to achieve this. Although there are certain things that in the scientific community that we agree upon. Okay, and one of the ways that we can set this kind of system is what we call the 5 kingdoms system. So each kingdom being a really broad group of living things. So we have the animal kingdom, the plant kingdom, the fungi kingdom, and then 2 which would be a little bit more unfamiliar to you, called the protists and the monarans. Okay, so where we're talking about microorganisms, things you can only see with using a microscope, and based on what the structure of their cell is like. Do they have a nucleus or not? Okay, that's kind of that's part of how we do it. But the idea is that there is a massive number of living things that might fit within each of these kingdoms, but we can recognize that each of these living things in these kingdoms are fundamentally different from each other. There are fundamental differences between animals and plants, between animals and fungi, and so on. Okay, but we're trying to identify and categorize every living thing. We've got to start from a broad level, but we can't just stay there. So what we have is that we have this system moving from this broad level of a kingdom all the way down to a specific living thing, which is the species. Okay, so we're kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, and species. So you can see as we go down the pyramid that we're narrowing down to one specific thing at the bottom. Okay, and so so that each living thing has a particular name associated with it based on the way that we group it together. Now, there's 7 things here, and it's a little bit tricky to remember. So we've come up with a helpful mnemonic that will allow you to remember it. So that is a little saying or a phrase that helps you to put these things in order. Okay? So it goes like this. Kids playing chicken on freeways get smashed. Not very pleasant, but certainly very memorable. Kids playing chicken on freeways get smashed. Kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. That's the sequence, the order of which those levels go. Kids playing chicken on freeways get smashed. Okay, but so why do we bother classifying living things at all? What's the point of this whole system? Well, you know, we want to be able to find order and logic and meaning and organisation to the things around us, but it also gives us particular benefits. It allows us to distinguish between different kinds of organisms. You know, being able to distinguish between a black bear and a brown bear, or a grizzly bear or a panda. being able to distinguish between bears and things like koalas, which aren't bears. Okay? It allows us to identify living organisms anywhere in the world. So being able to actually kind of fit all the living things on Earth into the same sort of system. It allows us to identify any new organisms we find. Are they, where do they fit within our system? How do we name them? How do we group them based on what they're similar or different to? It allows us to also understand the structure and the operation, the way that it works of any new organisms we find, because based on putting them in certain categories, then we can see, well, they must be similar to these other things in certain ways and different to other things, okay, based on that organisation. It also makes it easier for us to summarise huge amounts of data or information into smaller, more manageable amounts. We've kind of, it's like a filing cabinet, being able to actually say, oh, well, rather than looking through a whole big pile of papers, that we have a system of where to look for things or where to sort things into. We also, it can communicate ideas about living things to the world around us more easily, because then we kind of have, a system and an organisation. It allows a more universal language, so that across cultural and language barriers that we have ways to describe living things. Otherwise, the way we might describe a bird in Australia might be fundamentally different to the way it might be described in Canada, for example, but we're actually talking about the same living thing. And part of this is kind of how there was a lot of confusion when dinosaurs were first discovered as a whole range of new living things, and so different ways that people would describe them and name them, assuming that we're finding multiple different things that are actually all examples of the same type of dinosaur, and that then, that created confusion that we still had to undo today. It also makes it easier for us to find a particular living thing in the environment, because based on the way it's classified, we know what it looks like, we know what features it has, we know where it's likely to be, so we know where to look. Okay, so if we're trying to collect a particular organism, it allows us to do that more effectively. And it also means that we can identify ancestors of organisms that are present day, or being able to actually trace things back into history as well. Okay, so we looked at what we mean by classification, this grouping things into categories based on their features. We looked at biological classification, being called taxonomy, and that we have a system for classifying living things. We establish things into 5 kingdoms is one way to do it. One thing to remember there, though, is that there is still debate in the scientific community as to how many kingdoms is appropriate or justified. Okay, it's not set in stone. But we also can then use some different levels of classification from kingdom down to species. We learnt the mnemonic, kids playing chicken on freeways get smashed, to help us to be able to identify the order of those, and looked at reasons as to why we classify living things. Alright, thanks very much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Bye for now.